Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, November 17th, 2025. And our friend, Colonel Jacques Baud, is here with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Thank you very much for inviting me again, and happy to be back with you. Hi.
Please subscribe and hit like button, helping us reaching more people. And Colonel, last week you went to Switzerland. You had an exhibition there. Let us know about your exhibition. What was that?
Well, it's an exhibition that, in fact, I exhibit my own collection of weapons and artifacts from the clandestine warfare during World War II. Um, so it's a huge exhibition with more than 500 artifacts that are exhibited, weaponry and sabotage items, documents, maps, and all that. And it's about the support provided by the Swiss intelligence during World War II to the Allied services, namely the SOE, the Special Operation Executive, and the OSS. You know that the OSS, that the predecessor of the CIA, was based in Switzerland during World War II. It had its European headquarters in Bern, the capital city. The operational command post of the OSS was just in a house where close to the one I was living to when I was living in Bern. And it's a fascinating story, in fact, of this cooperation between intelligence services against Nazism. And there are a lot of historians that have written about it, but there has never been an exhibition about that. So I decided to provide my collection to the Military Museum of Morges. Morges is a small city between Geneva and Lausanne on the Lake of Geneva in Switzerland. It's a very nice place, by the way, very nice to visit. It's a fantastic scenery. It's just on the lake. It's an old castle, a medieval castle. It's a military museum that belongs to the Swiss the Ministry of Defense, and they have welcomed this exhibition for 1 year. So it opened last week, and it will last until the end of next year. And this exhibition is precisely about the work of Swiss intelligence during World War II, essentially. Obviously, with the OSS, SOE, all that is documented. There are a lot of very interesting documents that are provided. So that's in essence what I did. There's a book that is behind me. It's written in French for now. It will be translated for the visitors. If there are visitors coming from abroad, they are small guides for the exhibition. Everything is translated in German, in English. I'm not sure about Italian, but everything is at least in French, English, and German for those who want to visit. All the explanations and description of objects, description, the history, and all that is translated in several languages, so everybody can visit. It was designed to welcome also foreign visitors. So you are welcome to visit. So it's a very nice one. It's very interesting. I think that it's also something that comes because, and that's also the rationale behind it. Beyond the mere historical interest, because you may probably know that 30 years ago, Switzerland had been let's say, was the object of a finger-pointing exercise because of the gold of the Jews and all that during World War II, and the alleged cooperation with the Third Reich and all that. And this is certainly an aspect of history. I'm not discussing that, but I also wanted to provide another aspect of the role of Switzerland during this part of history. And again, this is debatable, but my personal view is that because Switzerland was heavily engaged in secret agreements with allies, it had also to make some concessions to the Germans. That's a little bit how I see it, and as many historians see it. But 30 years ago, nobody talked about the role of Switzerland in favor of the resistance movement. And on that, therefore, there was a kind of a distorted view of the role of Switzerland during World War II. Again, I'm not challenging what others have written about the cooperation with the Germans. This certainly happened. I'm not sure it happened in that in the magnitude that was described, but that's my personal view. But I'm not challenging that. But I just wanted to provide another, not another view of that, but another aspect of the role of Switzerland. That was
another angle of the
another angle. Exactly. It's just viewing the history from. I mean, as everything, you cannot make a judgment based on a view from just one side. You have to look at both sides, and I think that's very much the purpose of this. So if you take the book, for instance, just as an example, it provides a lot of maps and a description of items. Sorry, I will put a little bit here. So all the different items are described quite in detail. And so it's a reference book that will be sold also in bookshops, not just in the museum, but you can buy it at the museum, of course. So that's a little bit what I have done last week. That's the reason I was not with you. But it's interesting because we'll probably talk about it because we had a coverage from the media. But and that's interesting. We had journalists coming, and they were quite impressed, actually. And we had excellent press coverage from the French side. When the writers came, the journalists made apparently a very good article, but it was refused by the reaction because it was too much in favor of the Allies. So we see that there is a complete distorted understanding of, first of all, of scientific work and historical work. And that's something that affects still our perception of conflicts today. We are unable today, and especially the media, to have, I would say, a scientific understanding of the conflicts. It's always assorted with judgment, with this idea that we need to condemn things, so we need to condemn one or the other, instead of looking at the events as they are, trying to understand them, trying to understand who make what for what reason and all that. Instead of that, we invent, literally. That's very clear when we see Ukraine, for instance, when we invent literally the Russian objectives for Ukraine. It's something that come out of the blue. The Russians have never said things that we say, and then we propagate the idea that the Russians want to attack Europe and all that. So that's an approach to history and to the current event that is extremely, in my view, extremely disturbing, because I was used as member of the intelligence community to have an approach that is really fact-based, and that's very much what my exhibition is about. It's a fact-based approach. There is no, it's not for me trying to propagate an ideology or things like that, but we just based on the documents, and I have a lot of documents that are really unique, literally. that shows how the Swiss services worked with the OSS. As an example, OSS Alan Dulles, who later became the head of the director of the CIA, was based in Bern during World War II, and we have a lot of documents. I have original document in the exhibition. So again, this is not. I'm not trying to ideologize the war or to trying to propagate an idea or something like that. I'm just presenting documents that nobody wanted to see or nobody wanted to exhibit before. I did that in order to provide the public a complete understanding of history. And I was there for 1 week, so I had the opportunity to meet the visitors and to talk to them. They were extremely grateful to have this view. By the way, it was not only Swiss visitors. We had already visitors coming from abroad, and they were extremely grateful to have this comprehensive understanding of history and not just what the media say. And that's if I reach that point, I think my objective is reached. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, great to know that. Carl, you talk about the facts. We had a UN resolution and to condemn Nazism and neo-Nazism, and at the UN General Assembly. And here is the list of the countries that who voted in favor, who voted against. And looking at the map, you see the whole West has failed to condemn Nazism. What is going on? You've mentioned the history of the World War II. We know what has happened during those days. And what's happening today in the West that they fail to understand, they fail to condemn Nazism.
Well, it's a very interesting vote. First of all, because it's not the first one of its kind. I mean, Russia proposes this subject to votation every year, in fact, and this has been it was after the Cold War, probably before, but I don't remember exactly when it started. But basically, every year the Russian delegation proposes more or less the same text. It's a condemnation not just of Nazism, but also the current expressions of Nazism, including neo-Nazism, and the various expression of that, including racial discrimination and all that. And for years, it's also very interesting, and that's also an interesting fact, that for years, you had only two countries who voted against this resolution. That was the US and Ukraine. For years, there were the two only nations or there were probably those small states in the Pacific area who say everything the US say, so they're funded by the US. So there are probably those two. But basically, you had US and Ukraine. The US, the rationale for voting against the resolution is about the freedom of expression, and this is a rationale I can understand. I can understand that. When it comes to Ukraine, I'm not sure that's exactly the rationale, the reason why they voted, because obviously it goes against. Not that Ukraine is a Nazi government, but the problem is that the history of Ukraine is complex. And this is something that I describe in my other book, Covert Wars in Ukraine. I try to explain that for Western Europeans, if you talk, for instance, of the second Panzer Division Das Reich, the German SS division Das Reich. This is the division that committed several massacres, especially in France, and the very famous massacre of Oradour-sur-Glane in France just after the landing in Normandy. And it where they massacred completely a village with all inhabitants and all that. And in France, this division is very famous for that. But 1 year before, I mean, some months before that, the same division was committed in Ukraine by the Germans, and it liberated Kharkov against the Soviets, against the Red Army. And that's an illustration of the complexity, because for a lot of Ukrainian at that time, by the way, a large majority of Ukrainians fought in partisan warfare for the Allies. But you had some nationalists that you could call ultranationalists today, who fought for the independence of Ukraine, who fought both against the Germans at time. It depends. I mean, they have changed sides many times. So we also have to say that, but they fought the Germans and the Soviets. And of course, when the Germans managed to defeat the Soviet, especially in Kharkov, the Nazi became the heroes of the Ukrainian nationalists. Therefore, the same soldiers who were heroes in Ukraine were war criminals in France. And they are perceived, of course, differently from the French and from the Ukrainians. And that's also, if you look at the badge of the Azov brigade, regiment, and all that, it's reminiscent of the symbol that you had on the tanks of the Second Panzerdivision Das Reich, the German SS division. So you have a very similar insignia. This is the vertical I with the N, and this is the Wolfsangel, which the Azov regiment has with the N in the right direction, if you want, and during the Das Reich division had a reversed image of the N, but this is just a detail. In essence, what is important to understand is this double or ambiguous perception of history and all that. And therefore, and it's also very interesting when we mentioned that when we, for instance, Vladimir Putin talks about these ultranationalist forces in Ukraine, he never says Nazi, he says neo-Nazi, which is quite different also when semantically. Nazi is the ideology we know from World War II against the Jews and all that, while neo-Nazi is probably more a behavior, I would say. It's more a behavior. It's more a psychological posture rather than a political one, if I can summarize a little bit. Some may find other definitions or other ways to explain it, but I think there is a fundamental difference between the Nazi during World War II and the neo-Nazi we have today with the SS during World War II didn't have all the tattoos that we see on the combatants of the Azov brigade today, for instance. So we see that there's something very different there. And but the result may be very similar. It's intolerance, is racism, is you have a lot of, let's say, consequences that are very similar, and some behavior are very similar. But nevertheless, there are two different things. And what we have now in Ukraine is closer to neo-Nazism than Nazism. Even if you read my books, I have I tried to study those groups. And in my first book, Operation Z, I made even a kind of a catalog, if you want, of all these ultranationalist groups. And their rhetoric is very, very similar to the one we had during World War II. It is. And again, some people may find it identical. Again, I don't want to discuss that, but what the important thing here is to understand that there's a very different understanding of the role of the Germans for the Ukrainians. The Germans granted for the first time some kind of independence to the western part of Ukraine during World War II. And for a very short time, you had this first independent Ukraine, because Ukraine has never been independent. It is, in fact, independent since the end of the Cold War, namely independent since the end of 1991. But before that, you have no country as such who was called Ukraine, even if Ukraine had a separate seat than the Soviet Union in the UN General Assembly. But this is for other reasons. Anyway, so this is this ambiguous understanding of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and all that is probably the explanation why Ukraine always voted against the resolution proposed by the Russians. But more recently, especially after the beginning of the special military operation, namely in February 2022, then all European countries and Western countries at large started to vote against it. And Switzerland even voted against it at one point, and now they abstain. It's another way of voting against, in fact, but it's a little bit a softer way to express it. In any case, the position of the Western countries is now the same as the US. It says that it is a restriction to the freedom of thinking and freedom of expression. So but the real motivation behind this rejection is that they will never accept something coming from Russia. This is the point. And it's very interesting, because I think the Russians continue to propose this resolution with I think, again, nobody in the Russian government told me that, but I'm sure it's a way to show the contradiction of the Western world. And this is exactly by the way, the phase in which we are today, especially since the beginning of the special military operation. But the closer we come to the end of the conflict, the more we see that there is a fundamental contradictions between the ideals, the values that we allege or claim to protect in the West, and what we do in effect, because we promote, allegedly, or we claim to promote human rights and all that, but we bomb people in the Middle East since 30 years. We know with no reason. We attack countries with no reason, against even the vote of the UN General Assembly, or even against the decision of the UN Security Council, meaning that we theoretically advocate the international law. We don't abide by international law. We can allow ourselves not to abide by international law, which is already a contradiction, but there are many others. And we fight corruption, and we see that the country we help in Ukraine is heavily corrupted, and every day we have more allegation and accusation in the news, even coming from Ukraine itself, about corruption and all that. But this is the kind of contradictions in which we are, and we are not even consistent with our own values. And I think that's exactly what this vote in the General Assembly shows. Because regardless of what our relations are or should be with Russia, we have this ideal of combating these ideologies that are against democracy, regardless of, that should be beyond what we think about Russia. But it's not. And that shows exactly. But you listen to Kaya Kalas, listen to all these people, and you see that we are unable to act based on what we claim to defend, namely values, democracy, the rule of law, and all that. That's something that we have lost. And again, this vote is just an additional demonstration of how we fail in our understanding of democracy, and not even mentioning all the restrictions, even more restrictions we have on the freedom of expression, on social networks, in the press, in the media, that if you have the slightest opinion in favor of Russia, you will be totally excluded from mainstream media and all that. All that is exactly what we combated against during the Cold War. And we are even worse than the Cold War, because I remind you that I have mentioned that several times, but in during the Cold War, you could buy the Pravda or Literaturная Gazeta, Komsomskaya Pravda, and so on in the news outlets in Europe. There was no restriction for the Soviet press, even though it was a communist press. But the fact of the matter is, or was, that we were confident that we had the best system. We were confident that we had the best law, the best values. We had, there was some kind of Darwinistic approach of information, if you want. We were so confident that we were on the right path that we didn't need even to prohibit other ideas, other news, other medias, and all that. The problem is that today, because we have infringed so much against international law and all that, we have lost this self-confidence. We are not sure we are on the right track, and therefore we need to add protection to what we say, and therefore we need to restrict the freedom of expression. I think everything we see today in terms of limitation of freedom of expression, limitation of freedom of press, and so on and so forth, is simply an expression of our an inability to be, let's say, confident in what we think. It's an expression of, let's say, the doubt in which our society lives. It's a society that has no longer the confidence of being on the right track. We know that we are not on the right track. We make decisions, our leaders make decisions that leads to catastrophic economic decisions that lead to more unemployment, that lead to more division in the world. It's not we are no longer in a mood trying to try to understand the other. We build walls instead of building bridges. And that's this kind of uncertainty, this kind of insatisfaction, this kind of inability to dialogue with others, in fact, requires that we protect ourselves differently. We cannot uh, take for granted that simply because we have the best values, then our information will be better than the other. It's not that, because we don't have the best values, to at least in our mind, but it's not what we apply. Therefore, we need to be more protectionists about the freedom of expression. So the freedom of this abolition of freedom of expression, and all that, is an expression of weakness, not of strength. Everything we do when we don't have the courage to vote in favor of such resolution as the one you presented before, is an expression of our weakness. If we were strong enough, if we were self-confident, we could, without any problem, say we agree with that. But we are no longer self-confident. And therefore, we need to protect ourselves. We have to make a distance between ourselves and the let's say the rest of the world in a certain sense. And the map you showed shows exactly, by the way, the divide we have also economically. The emergence of BRICS, the emergence of all these alternative structures, the Security Organization of Shanghai, Security Cooperation in Shanghai, all these alternative fora are now taking more space on on the political scene generally, and that reflects exactly this map. You see, so there is. So, if you want, we are inconsistent, but the world is not inconsistent. The world is consistent in understanding that the West is inconsistent. And that's a little bit the conclusion we can draw from that episode, which is sad, in fact.
Carol, do you think that there is a difference right now in Ukraine between the United States and Europeans? Because on one hand, you see Donald Trump, despite all these rhetorics every day coming out of his, administration, it seems after all they don't want the war in Ukraine. They're trying to put all the burden on Europeans. On the other hand, you don't see that much of unwillingness on the part of Europeans to say, no, we don't want that. There's support in the case of Ukraine. We had the French foreign minister. He has admitted that 140 billion interest-free loan to Ukraine, which the EU plans to provide using Russian frozen assets, will not be repaid by Kiev. This is huge if they go in that direction. And Macron is talking about a 10-year contract, somehow agreement between France and Ukraine to support Ukraine. Are they really thinking of the continuation of the conflict in Ukraine by this attitude?
Well, there are different aspects of your question. First of all, I wouldn't trust so much the word of the French. That's the first point. Macron is known for his flip-flop decisions, and so he may change his view tomorrow. So I don't put too much weight on that. When you talk about those frozen assets and all that, you had the president of Euroclear, Valérie Urbain, who recently just said that she is ready to go in front of court if European Union decides to use those assets. So we see that even within Europe, we reach a point where those ideologues who lead Europe, especially in the European Commission, start to be confronted by those who have a more realistic approach. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to Euroclear, as an example, and that's a very similar position that was taken by the Belgian Prime Minister, because at the end of the day, if those frozen assets are confiscated, which is against international law, that may have consequences, economic consequences, and therefore you may not want to go into things that will lead into some disaster. And now we are in the situation where those who are realistic starts to say to the others, "Well, stop now. We have to put some limits to the game. Otherwise, we'll go nowhere, and we will be bankrupt without even wanting, and for no reason." So we still have those who are in command, such as Macron, Keir Starmer, Friedrich Merz, and others, who are unable to backtrack what they said, and therefore will continue to. This is the no reverse gear approach to the conflict.
Carol, sorry for interrupting you. It's not just about France. We've learned from Germany that Germany plans to spend 100 million euros on drones.
Yes, yes, no, I know, but it's basically the same issue. The thing is that what you have in Europe are a political elite who are unable to think rationally to the problem and is unable to take the reverse gear, if you want. That's a problem. The US has an advantage, if you want, in a certain sense, because of the change in the presidency earlier this year, that allowed Trump to say that was the war of the previous administration, and that's not mine. So he doesn't need to backtrack what was said before. He can just say, well, that's not my war. So he's a more comfortable position to change the focus of the US foreign policy, if I can put it that way. Because of course he can blame the previous administration. So that's probably the reason why today the US, and beyond the whole MAGA issue and all that, and this the senseless funding and the bottomless funding of this conflict that the US supported so far, but now they realize that it is a black hole where you just pour money with, and there is no return. Therefore, it's better to stop. And if others want to do that, well, let's the European do it. But for us, we need to save money. We don't need to put more funding in something that will have no effect at the end. So the US is a more comfortable position now, and that for that reason, it helps the US trying to take this unexpected role as mediator in the conflict. And that's exactly when we say, well, that's Biden's war and Trump's peace. Exactly this idea. So the problem is that in Europe, nobody seems to have enough courage or common sense or both to realize that we are engaging into something that has no and into something that, even if we cannot even define what is our objective, but what is certain is that whatever the result of this conflict will be, all the negative consequences will be borne by the Ukrainians. This is a Ukrainian society who will suffer from this conflict. And when you hear recently, Kaya Kallas said that the war in Ukraine is a good bargain. It's a good bargain to achieve a victory against Russia. So that means this is exactly what you had, I think, a couple of years ago. You had people, I think it was Richard Blumenthal, or probably Instagram, one of the both, who said that it was supporting Ukraine against Russia is a good idea because you don't or better you say you save U.S. lives. I mean, the Ukrainians die for us.
Actually, it was Lindsey Graham as well. Lindsey Graham together with Blumenthal.
It was probably both. I don't remember. But in any case, that was the idea. You see, so this is a kind of a cynical approach to the conflict, saying, well, we support them, so they die and we don't need to die. And the result is that we fight Russian, but we just spend some dollars. That's fine, and they spend their life. This is so cynical in the approach that it's beyond human, or human thinking, or human approach. I mean, this is something that is extremely disturbing if you think about it. And Kaya Kallas now says the same thing. Using Ukraine is a good argument.
Colonel, just last week we had Lindsey Graham saying to the American people, we're killing the right people and cutting the tax. So what else do you want us to do?
This is exactly that. You see, there's this, and we see those people who are comfortably seated in their seat and nice offices, who decide that there should be war and that other should die for the sake of some flimsy idea of a victory against Russia. By the way, a victory that nobody has been able to define, or victory or defeat. I mean, victory against Russia or the defeat of Russia. We don't know exactly what that means. How do we measure that? How do we define that? So, meaning that without any definition, we spend Ukrainian life for something we don't know what exactly. So that's if you look at the whole process, this is extremely disturbing, as I said, extremely cynical at the same time. And that's probably what the Ukrainians are starting to realize, that we are in fact using their lives for some obscure political objective. And that's it's totally immoral, if you want. And if we see, because the problem is that this conflict could have had a political solution before it you had the Russian intervention in February 2022, but nobody wanted to implement the political solution, and we know that it was deliberate. We know that those who were in charge of implementing or advising those who were supposed to implement, all these people refused the implementation of the political agreement. So we created the situation where at the end only force could solve the situation, and at a very expensive cost, because nothing is more expensive than human life. And we let people do that. And not only that, but we wanted that because we wanted a victory, or some kind of victory against Russia. And now it's failing. So we double down in failure. But those who pay the price are the Ukrainians. And of course, then we, of course, have, and we are in exactly the same dynamic we discussed before, because we want Ukrainians to sacrifice their lives again for a kind of elusive Russia's defeat. We have to lie on the real what's happening on the field, meaning that we say that the Russians have more casualties, that they suffer more than the Ukrainians, and all that. I'm not able, and I think nobody is factually able to say that to say some numbers about the losses, both human and material losses, that both sides experience. But we know definitely that regardless of the ratio and all that, definitely Ukrainians pay a heavier price than the Russians. This is absolutely clear. So that means that even if we declare that Ukrainians are our friends, we are still using their life to achieve some kind of obscure objective that we have not been able to define. So this is, if you look at this on this way, you said, and that explains why we need to have now restriction for the freedom of expression, restriction in the media, because if you start telling the truth, then you are just in an imbalanced situation towards your own what you just said. And that's why it's interesting, by the way, because when I wrote my books, I looked at various sources in the media and all that, and I always noticed that the Ukrainian media even if, because it's wartime for them, and we can understand that the media are very controlled under control in Ukraine, which is, in my view, totally understandable in a war situation. But nevertheless, Ukrainian journalists are more critical about the conflict than Western or European journalists are towards the conflict. And that's very telling. That means that the weight of propaganda and disinformation is even stronger in the West than it is in Ukraine itself. Meaning that we make every effort to misuse Ukraine in reality. We don't even listen when, for instance, when you look at the Battle of Pakrovsk and all that, in the West, you still have TV channels, especially in France, that tells you that all the Russian success in this era are simply propaganda, that in fact Ukrainians are winning. It's just crazy. I mean, this is totally insane. But in Ukraine itself, people know what the truth is, and they tell it. So when we even deny the Ukrainians to tell us the truth, that means that we are definitely misusing Ukraine for obscure objectives that we have. So this is beyond disturbing, to be honest, because it shows that we have decided that the fight against Russia, or not even Russia, Vladimir Putin, because at the end of the day, it comes about one person. The price for that will be the life of all the Ukrainians, basically. We're ready to do that. I'm very surprised, in fact, that Ukrainians are, I mean, they're probably starting to react to this. I know that some people reacted, and when I wrote this book on covert wars in Ukraine, I noticed that a lot of Ukrainians become extremely critical about all that, because they know, there is a lot of people who know someone of their family or some relatives that know the reality of the ground, because they live in the eastern part of the country, or they have some people have died or have been maimed during the combats, and therefore they know the truth, and they know the price that the government is asking them to pay, and they know the price the Europeans are asking them to pay. And when they even try to sell products to Europe, like grain or things like that, Europe refuses, because because the prices that the Ukrainians are offering are too low for the Europeans. So we see that we are definitely totally misusing the Ukrainians, and that, in my view, that casts a very, very dark light on our understanding. We try to say that when we are in favor of Ukraine and against Russia, this is in favor of freedom and all that. I think it's the complete opposite, because this is everything we do shows that we have a completely lack of respect for the Ukrainians. We don't have more respect for the Russians either, by the way. And as I said many times, because of my white hair, you see that I was a Cold Warrior. But during the Cold War, we never fought against Russians or against Poles or against Czechs. We were fighting a system. We're fighting for good or bad reason. We can argue on that. But the whole purpose of the whole Cold War was fighting against a system. On the eastern part of the Europe, they were fighting against the capitalism, imperialism, and you can find different names. And we were fighting communism, Marxism, and all that. Whether it was right or not, we can discuss that. But the fact of the matter is that we were not targeting individuals. We were fighting against a system, not against individuals. Today, when we restrict Russians to visit us, when during the Cold War, we were inviting Soviets to see how the West is, because we were confident that we were better. And that would be a positive propaganda that the visitors will take back in his or her country. Today, we are not even confident about this. Therefore, we restrict visa. We want to prevent them to see who we are, but probably because we are not so good. So there is a lot of interesting consideration, even probably even at philosophical level, because this is so against any principles that we had during the not the Second World War, the Cold War. Again, today we see that we target individuals. That's something we never did during the Cold War. So we try to individualize, to personalize, if you want, the war. We want that every Russian citizen could be responsible for this war. That's something we never did during the Cold War. So this understanding of war that we have today is, I think it demonstrates the imbalance we have in our own society, this inability to judge things through facts, this inability to have a balanced view over problems. And that applies to every kind of problems. I mean, we have already talked in on your channel about Iran, Palestine, and all that. And every time when we talk about those conflicts, we see that there's a very polarized reading of these conflicts. There's always a good guy and a bad guy, and of course, we are always the good guy. But then the bad guy is so bad that everything is allowed. You can allow yourself everything. You can go even beyond international law, because the person is so bad that, in fact, we are right to do everything we can against it. And this kind of view that excludes all the nuances of grays, but go exclusively between white and black. And in our society, but this is something that, of course, now we talk about geopolitics, we talk about Russia, we talk about these issues. But if you look at our own society, we see exactly the same thing. You cannot criticize people, I mean, because even if we don't criticize their skin color, but if you criticize the behavior of some people, you will be a challenge, because the person you criticize is of a different skin color. And even if in your judgment skin color doesn't play any role, but you will be considered, everything is considered black and white. There is no nuance in that. And we see that at every level in the society. And that leads to this absence of compromise, the look for the right balance in things. This is, you exclude people you don't want. You don't try to negotiate. You don't try to open a dialogue. You don't try to understand. You just exclude. The one who doesn't think like you is excluded. In fact, we are in the West, and that's very true in Europe, we are reinventing some forms of fascism and all that. And some people have said that we are now in a phase where we see that, despite the fact that we claim to be in favor of all these nice values that we had after World War II, in fact, we don't implement neither. And we see that we criticize Russia, but when it comes to all those Palestinians who are killed deliberately, and when we see those children killed as a hobby, as it was said by that is in the Israeli press itself, when you had people confessing that they were killing kids as hobby. Nobody in the West will condemn that. Nobody in the West even mentioned that. So we have this double standard that applies to some people, and we apply laws to some people and not to others. We are the good ones, so we can decide who should live and who should die. The others, of course, don't have the luxury of doing that. And that's exactly what we have done in the last 30 years. I mean, nobody can, I've never seen anyone who could elaborate or define what were the objectives of all these wars that we conducted. Why did we disrupt so many societies? And we today, that's the interesting part, because we made those wars without objectives, without any consideration for human life, because we had the more powerful weapons, so we could destroy people, kill them without paying a big price, if you want. And today we pay the price back. We pay it back now, because now we made those societies unlivable. I mean, you cannot live anymore. I mean, we destroyed those societies. And therefore, what do? Logically, they try to they need work, they need to live, so they come to our place. And that's part of this immigration that we cannot control anymore. So we destroyed those societies, and now because those societies cannot work anymore, they come to us. And now we have a problem with them. So this is a total absence of understanding of the consequence of what we do. We think, in French, you would say that you don't see further than the tip of your nose. We are always seeing problems in the short term.
I really believe that there is something deeply wrong with the leadership in Europe, because when you look, it's not just about the leadership, it's just about the alternatives as well. You know, when we see, for example, Kemi Badenoch, in the head of Conservative Party in the United Kingdom, saying that what Ukraine and Israel are doing they're doing our job in the region. You know, when you see Merz in the aftermath of the Israeli attack on Iran, said Israelis are doing our daily job against. What does Germany have against Iran? What is the problem between Iran and Germany? I don't see any of that. But it seems that in their mind there is some sort of strategy, some sort of ideology, some sort of mindset. There. I don't know if that's a strategy. It could be in a I don't know if we can connect that with the United States, with the deep state in the United States, but they have an ideology that they want to achieve. I don't know what that ideology is about. Do you understand what's going on behind these sort of strange, statements on the part of the European leaders, not only those one in power, but the alternatives in Europe?
Well, the former French Prime Minister Rocard used to say, "Never underestimate stupidity." And I think we are exactly in that kind of scheme. But it goes beyond that. You are perfectly right to say it. We are also in something that is beyond conventional politics. We see the same behavior from the right or the left when we go to political parties. We tend to have the same irrationality on both sides of the, let's say, the political spectrum. And that's also something that worries me, because that means that regardless of what the ideology might be, there is something that goes beyond that, and that people are not up to the mark. They are no longer people with a personality. I mean, those individuals that we had in Europe as leaders, um, that can be Charles de Gaulle in France, that could be Konrad Adenauer in Germany. I mean, you had a lot of those people, especially in the 60s. Those people who used to fight during World War II, by the way. Those people who had war experience, who knew what war means, who understood what dialogue means, by the way. That's also something, because when you fight a war, you also know the value of peace. And therefore, all these people in the 60s in Europe and around the world, by the way, you had a lot of very wise people in those times. Those also in the post-colonial wars and all that, you had a lot of very wise people emerging that had great ideas. They wanted to build states, they want to build nations. They had a lot of ambitions for their countries, and they understood that in order to fulfill those ambitions, you had to have some kind of stability. And stability means that you have to be able to talk to other. That you mean that you need to be able to understand each other. You need to have a dialogue. And even if you don't accept the idea of the other, you may still want to talk to him. So this is, and therefore going to keep a relation beyond the mere ideology and even political views, because we have a common human heritage, if you want. And this idea was, I think, very strong in many of our leaders. But when you talk about leaders of this, the 60s, 70s or so, I mean, the afterward, just after war period in Europe, these are personalities that everybody refers to today, but we don't have those people anymore. When you, especially in Europe, probably in the US, it's probably less obvious. But in Europe, when you talk about the French president or the German chancellor or prime minister in UK, everybody says, "Oh, but we had this guy, and this one was." Today, we don't have those people anymore. We have bureaucrats with no big ideas, not much education, with limited intelligence, who are not able to understand the world, who can only stick to their beliefs rather than having a conscious and intelligent approach to the world. And therefore, they need to stick to slogans. If you listen to Friedrich Merz, it's exactly that. I mean, and all the lessons that we learn after World War II, namely the importance of the rule of law, the importance of international law, the international law as a reference point for international dialogue, for also national dialogue as well. All these lessons have been completely forgotten because we cannot afford to follow these lessons anymore. We are so wrong that today we have even to deny those lessons. And that's tragic, because it shows that we could, I'm confident that we are not heading towards World War III. I'm still hoping that something will stop us before that. But nevertheless, we are heading in a direction that goes towards more tensions and not an appeasement. And remember what Ursula von der Leyen herself said in her allocution to the State of the Union in September 2022: no appeasement, no negotiation. And again, what I said many times, if we were Ukrainians, if I were Ukrainian, I would certainly fight, and I would certainly fight the Russians as Russians fight Ukrainians. because for some reason you fight for your country and you try to do the best because that's your country, and you're not in a position to reshape the world if you want. So you fight. The problem is when you're outside of the conflict, when you're an outsider, when you have the luxury of being outside it, I mean, as a spectator, how can you be involved as an actor? And that's something that I cannot understand from the side of European Union. But not only, that's the same reasoning applies to my country, Switzerland, who managed during World War II to remain outside of the conflict while still helping the Allies. But it managed to be to keep outside of the conflict and to help people as much as it could, which was probably not very spectacular, but at least it tried to do it. Today, it's complete opposite. We are an actor of the conflict. And that's something that seems completely out of the debate, because we should use the fact that we are not in the conflict, try to help those who fight to solve their conflict in a different way. They fight, okay, this is war, so you have these artillery fire exchange and people shooting at each other, okay, but besides this, there are probably on backstage, we could work with diplomacy, we could work with opening dialogue, with establishing relationship, trying to see where we could smooth the angles, smooth the relationship. But no, we are not doing that. We are, on the contrary, we are trying to make it more difficult to have more discussions. And that's something, by the way, when Trump, again, I'm very strong critic of Trump, but for that, in that case, for Ukraine, at least he tried something. At least he tried to open a dialogue. And at least that, I'm not sure it was very successful, but at least he tried it. And trying is already something, because as we say in French, the first step is the most important. And he tried this. I think he could do better. He probably can do better. This is something that the future will tell. But in any case, the problem is that the Europeans even tried to make this first step even more difficult for Donald Trump. And that's very worrying. Instead of taking the opportunity to engage with the US on the same direction, try to develop some kind of new channels of communication with the Russians, at least to keep a communication channel open in case you want to engage in some kind of dialogue. But no, nobody did that. On the contrary, we managed to take more sanctions, try to make the wall even higher between us and Russia. By the way, that's exactly what some said. I think it was probably Eisenhower, not Eisenhower, sorry, Kissinger, who said that about what happened in 2014, as you had this first confrontation between the West and Russia. And of course, based on all the discussion about Ukraine joining EU and so things like that. The Kissinger said, well, instead of using Ukraine as a bridge between Europe and Russia, we used Ukraine as a wall. And that's very true. We used Ukraine since that time as a way of as a trench or a wall or whatever that separates us from Russia, instead of using that as a bridge. And I think that's extremely. I think that's extremely a pity that from the side of the Europeans not to have understood that. And for reasons that lies in the mindset of some people. When you listen to people like Friedrich Merz, Ursula von der Leyen, or Kaja Kallas, you see that the problem they have with Russia goes beyond rationality. in something. And if you look at their family history, you will see that you may find some roots of their hate towards the Russians. So it's no longer a rational behavior. It's a behavior that has been influenced by the education, by the relation they had with the probably family and all that. And now this is something that translates into more adversarial position towards Russia. I come from a family that used to make war. I mean, I have my I mean, grand uncle who fought the Russians. He was a general in the Napoleonic army, and he fought against the Russians in the Napoleonic Wars. I had my family also fighting against the Germans during World War One, resistance in World War Two. But I was never educated in my family to hate the Russians, to hate the Germans. On the contrary, we try to develop, how to say that, a culture in the family to understand the other, to understand your adversary, not to confront your adversary. So,
Yeah. It was, I think, Carl, the main point, your main point is so important. You know, instead of making barriers, obstacles, you have to make bridges. And it's the West is, I, the West is somehow the policy in the West is about isolation, isolating other countries instead of making bridges. I,
this is that, and that's extremely sad.
yeah, yeah,
But
it's, yeah, I totally get it, Carl. Yeah. Thank you so much, Carl. Great
my
pleasure
pleasure.
as always. Learning from you. Great points you make during these podcasts, and it's so much important for the future of this planet and the world we want to make for our next generations. Thank you so much for being with us today,
Thank
Carl.
you.